Difference between public sector banks and private sector banks. So, what are the basic difference that arise in case of public sector banks and private sector banks? Let's see. Private sector banks are owned by the government either directly or indirectly through RBI, whereas the private sector banks are either owned by any private individual or any kind of enterprise. So, the first difference arises in case of ownership. The public banks are government owned and the private sector banks are owned by private individual or enterprises. The next one, public sector banks may be set up as a statutory corporation by special acts passed by parliament. On the other hand, public sector banks are always set up under the Company Act. So another difference is that the public sector banks is always done by government act and parliament, which is passed by the parliament, whereas the private sector banks are established under the Companies Act. Next, public sector banks are Indian banks and they do not include any kind of foreign banks. But the private sector banks may include both Indian as well as foreign banks. So, we can see that all the foreign banks in our country are private sector banks. Next, public sector banks aims at serving the society beside earning profit, but the private sector banks are solely driven by the profit motive. Next, public sector banks have offices or branches throughout the country. They will be found in semi-urban, rural and urban areas, but private sector banks are mainly concentrated in the semi-urban and urban areas. They do not have any kind of branches in the rural areas.